All right, we're on tape.
Hello, my name is Cathy Vaughan, and this is my husband Scottie, and we worked in the cotton mill for a long, long time. He worked a whole lot longer than I did. I was a weaver in the cotton mill. I went in the cotton mill to learn how to weave, and I came out a weaver. And he was a fixer.
And she used to fuss at me all the time because I didn't fix her machine.
He was actually my fixer. So some nights we would go in and fight all night and then go home next morning and make up. And when I went into work on the second shift, first time. And when I went to work, I went to learn how to weave upstairs. Miss Faye Patton taught me how to weave on the little bitty looms. And they were so tiny. That's why they always wanted somebody tall. They weren't but about this wide, so you could stand right here and work your way around and start at least 4 machines at the same time. And I worked on, and another thing about working upstairs, you had to learn how to walk with the floor because it did this. There were so many machines, the floor rocked. So you had to learn to walk on the floor. Well, I worked on the second fire for a little while, and then I got mad and quit. And I went back to work and worked on second a little while longer. Of course, I never did like second shift. But when I went back, I went to work in the weave rooms downstairs. And they had great big rooms down there. And when I went in, I had Miss Debbie Williams, Archer, training me how to weave on the big ones. And so that was fun because Debbie was fun to work with. And so when I went in to the downstairs weave room, and I worked 15 years and come out of the downstairs weave room. We worked the last third shift there was at the cotton mill. I think it was what, about 7 of us?
Something like that.
Yeah, about 7 of us that night in the cotton mill when it shut down. And I used to think, I just wish this place could just shut down. And then when it did, we cried. We cried. I thought, what in the world are we going to do now? And because that was a lifeline. I mean, lots of families was raised. You look around at all this land around here, the people worked in that cotton mill and paid for everything from that cotton mill. And so it was a lifeline, and the people was just like family. You had my first boss man was Charlie Coleman, and he was a real hoot to work with. And when I quit off the second shift then and went back, you have to have a reference that they can call and see if you was a good worker. Well, they called him, and he said, yeah. But when I went back on third. So he hunted me down, and he said, girl, if I'd known you was going to come to work on third shift and not come to work with me on second, I wouldn't have told him you was worth a hoot. And it was just a big family. Everybody knowed everybody, they knowed the kids. We took care of everybody. If you was sick, even if you was out of work, we'd make up money so you wouldn't miss a paycheck. And a lot of people I worked with, they was just like family. And then when the mill shut down and you had to go somewhere else, it was just a shock. I mean, you don't have family like you have family at home. And he was a fixer, and he always says he wasn't never really a fixer. He just carried a toolbox. And but Faye Patton taught me how to weave to start with, and a lot of people that I worked with are no longer around. I worked with people like Dixie Tate, Sue Burks, and Edna Williams, and Betty Turner, and Flash was her husband's name, and he worked up in the spinning room. So if you got me out of the weave room, I was lost. I would have never found my way out of that cotton mill if you took me anywhere else. So I went in one door and come out the same door. So it was very interesting, and the looms, down there I worked production. So if your machine wasn't running, you wouldn't make money. So I worked hard to keep my job running, and then if something went wrong and he didn't fix it quick enough, I was on to him to get my money going. And it was a hard job. But when I had to go back to work, when I went to work at Galax, I thought, shoot, I'd go back tonight if they'd just open it up and let me go back. And if you was a weaver, some nights you could go in, and it's according to how the weather was, the humidity was, how your job was running. Some nights you could go in, and you always wore aprons with your tools in it. And some nights I could go in and like I was going to start eating my sandwich at 12 o'clock at night because I always worked third shift. I'd put my sandwich in my apron pocket, and sometimes at 7 o'clock the next morning, I'd throw it in the trash on the way out because I didn't have time to eat it that night. And then other times I could go in there and get everything straightened out, and it would run for an hour and a half or 2 hours at a time, and not have the machine stop out. And that was the good nights. And then you'd have in the wing room, you have cotton everywhere. And it just lays on everything. And then you come out, you have cotton in your nose, you have cotton in your hair, you have cotton up your nose and in your ears. But then you have these nights where they have to blow the cotton down off of the machines. So them nights, your job just wasn't gonna run because you got cotton blowing everywhere. And at that time, you didn't have to wear a mask, you didn't have to wear earplugs or nothing. So it was just a mess, cotton everywhere. And I always hated the nights they blowed the looms down with cotton. Y'all know, don't you? You're sitting there going, yeah. And it was a total mess. But it was a good job. When I think back on it now, that was the life. Everybody cared about everybody. And I couldn't tell you about nothing else that went on in there. I know it started and come in as cotton and it went on down, but when I saw it last, it was cloth. And I don't know, I'm not the big storyteller like Becky is, so if y'all wouldn't know anything else, you just have to ask me how it went. And when I went, there was a lady asked me about the windows. Well, I worked in the very bottom, so there weren't any windows, and there were no windows anywhere. So I worked in the bottom, and at the very back part of the mill, you could go back there sometimes, and you could see water coming in from the river. It was seeping through the wall. And the first time I ever saw that, I thought, I'm not staying here very long, but I stayed there for 15 years, and watched that water coming in from the walls. But, and you could actually hear it when it was flooding, you could hear the water beating up against the mill. And it was very scary, because if it had broke through, it would have just took us all out. But luckily, it was well built and it held through. And I just stayed there in when I first went in, they had these one type of looms. And then over the years, it's gradually put in newer and newer machines. And I actually at one time had a job where I had half of my job was on the bottom floor and half of it was on the upper floor. So I had to run up and down the steps to keep my job going. And that was really hard because at that time, by the time I'd get the ones upstairs going and get downstairs, diesel stopped off. And then that was just constantly all the time. You was running up and down the steps to get that job going. And if you looms ain't running, you ain't making no money. So, and we worked on efficiency. So, so they paid you so much an hour, then your production is where you made your money. If you was willing to work and work hard, you made some really good money at that time. And then if you didn't, well, you just made average pay. And I always, when I think back on it now, I really made some good money. I don't know what I did with all of it, but I guess 3 kids probably took a lot of it. And but it was like family. And like I said, a lot of people that I work with they're gone. They're no longer with us. And I'm not like Becky. I didn't write a book, but I was putting down some names of people that I worked with, like Edna Williams and Betty Turner. And my boss man for years was Harold Funk. And I worked for Reuben Bonds. I worked for Tom Hill, and my family worked in the cotton mill. My grandma, Curry's mama, my mom, she worked in the cotton mill. And one time, I don't remember what it was over, and I was working with Tom Hill. I don't remember what it was over, but he took me in the office over something other, and I wasn't having it. And he said, you know, you're just like Margaret Moore. And I said, well, thank you. And they knew my line, they knew my family lines. But then I had a lot of people working in there. My mother worked in there. She worked right with me. Eugene Haynes worked there. Him and Mama actually worked together there at the end. And Sanders Haynes worked in there. I have worked with Sanders, and I've worked with a lot of my family in there. And it was a chore then, but when I look back on it, I'd like to go back through it. I'd go back, and I'd do it all over again. And I don't know what else to say, but if you got any questions, I'd be too glad to try to answer them. And I'm looking out here and I'm trying to see the people that worked in the cotton mill. There's two right there on the front line. I don't know, I don't remember you and don't.
Oh, my name's Steve. Thank you very much for your talk. Do you know where most of the cotton came from and when about did the mill shut down?
It shut down in '88. Yep. It was in about September of '88 because we didn't work all that winter. I remember we were laid off all that winter before we went back to work in the springtime. Yeah. And like I said, they weren't but about maybe 8 of us left on third shift. Now the next morning, daytime come in and they finished cleaning up. We didn't actually shut it down. We shut third shift down. And then they came in and cleaned it up and finished doing what needed to be done. And then at 3 o'clock they shut and locked the doors.
Wow.
So it was great loss to this community because that cotton mill has raised a lot of families around here and paid for a lot of lives. And it was looking back on it, it was a great life. And any more questions or?
Do you remember Edna Gwynn?
Pardon?
Do you remember Edna Gwynn?
Edna Gwynn?
Yeah, yes. Worked with her.
That's her mom.
Ah, yeah. Yeah, we worked with a lot of people, like Sheila Young, Fitzmore from up towards Stevens Creek, worked with him and his son, and I just, a lot of names that I'm at a loss for right now. Reuben Vaughan, Donnie Hill, worked with Donnie Hill, Debbie Archer, and when people got a job down there at the very end, usually they stayed a while. Once you learned that job and learned we could make some pretty good money at that time if you was willing to really work for it. And it was a good way to make a living. It was hard work. Now I can't say it wasn't hard work because, like I said, sometimes you could go in there and at that time you could smoke in the mill, and we had smoking booths. And back at that time, I smoked, and you could light a cigarette, but where my job was, I could light a cigarette at the smoking booth, but I could watch my job. So I'd light a cigarette, and if you work there long enough, you can hear the machine, hear the looms going clickety-clack, clickety-clack, clickety-clack. I always said they were saying, get to work, get to work, get to work. Well, when you hear one, you could hear a loom. I mean, you could have 40 different looms and one stop off, and if you was there long enough, you'd know which direction to go in where your loom stopped off. So I'd light a cigarette, and I'd hear a loom stop off, and I'd lay it down, and I'd make a round real quick, come back, take me another puff off a cigarette, and just, do it like that. But if I had a loom stop off, I'd go start that loom up, because that was my money. That's my money when that loom wasn't running. And I can't think of nothing else to say right now, so any more questions? Yes?
Becky told us about a saloon and a murder and all kinds of fighting and possible house of ill repute. So from your time, I had friends who worked there who would talk about the last day before Christmas.
Oh.
And the celebrating that happened.
Oh. Oh, you mean the days that all the women cook and.
Well, there's
And
probably no
nobody-
doubt.
Yeah, well, like at Christmas time, we always had this great big meal, and all the women that you worked with, I think the men got together and donated money to buy hams and all the drinks, and the women cooked all the money. So on the last night we worked, when we worked off for Christmas, we had everything set up. There wasn't really a whole lot of work going on that night, but we would start eating like 12 o'clock, and we would empty the tables at 7, getting ready to go home. So we pretty much just eat all night long on that night. So, anything else?
Other questions? I have one for Scotty. Besides carrying your tools, can you tell us a little more what you did as the fixer?
Yeah.
Well, we had to keep machines running because our weavers, they get upset if you didn't let them get their loom started back up. And you just I had a little box that made them in the shop there, and they were metal, and they had hooks on them, hang them on the front of the loom, carry around all you needed.
If you was when you would weave long enough, you would learn minor things that you could do yourself. So I would just go to the toolbox and get whatever tool I needed, and I would fix it myself.
You didn't really need him at all.
That's why he liked to work with me, because I could fix it as good as him.
Okay.
But yeah, it was, and an average job in the weave room for a weaver was maybe 25 looms. And I mean 48-inch looms, and there at the end they were 60-inch looms. And so the average job was about 25 looms. But if you was good at it and you could do good efficiency, you could have up to 40 or 45 looms. And then anything over the 25, it was extra money. So you could make some really good money if you was willing to work.
Were there any scheduled breaks at all?
No. No.
You got a break when you took it.
Yeah.
When you had time.
And then
you
you
had
didn't
time.
make as much money.
Yeah. Because like I said, I would take a sandwich with me, and sometimes I'd get to eat it, and sometimes I wouldn't. And Evelyn Williams was my Unifield tender for years, and she would, when she'd go get her cup of coffee, she'd bring me a cup of coffee. If he went to get a cup of coffee or drink, he'd bring me a cup of coffee. A lot of times I'd just set it up on what Becky was talking about, she-filled batteries. When I went to work, the batteries was gone. We had what they call Unifields. And I'd set my drink on the Unifield, hoping it would sit there till I got back around to get it. Half the time, at 15 to 7, I'd be going around getting my empty cups up so I could put them in the trash before I went home that morning. But she was talking about running we had Unifields, and we had Unifield tenders. Well, there at the end, they cut out the Unifield tenders, so the weaver had to tender on Unifields and runner looms too, which sometimes is pretty good. It's according if your Unifield tender was a good worker and she was willing to help you keep your job running, she was a big help to you, but sometimes they wouldn't, and I would just as soon do it myself as to depend on somebody else. So, but it was a job and a half when you did that, and then you have a fixer that sometimes don't do like they're supposed to. I'm going to tell stories on him.
I've always been slow, and I just get around fast.
I've got one more question.
Uh-huh.
Can you tell us about how the bells worked? Does anybody here remember I've heard that the bells would ring at particular times before you were supposed to be on each shift. Is that correct or not?
I don't know about that. When I worked in the mill, we didn't have time clocks. There was no such thing as a time clock. You went in, and your shift, everybody knew your shift started like us. Our shift started at 11 o'clock. You had to be on the job at 11 o'clock, but what told us it was 11 o'clock, they had red light bulbs all the way around the weave room. When them red lights come on, it's time for you to go to work. And then when the lights come on and it's time for you to go to work, a weaver has like a timer that clicks off the amount of cloth she works, and it was called a pick clock. And every few yards of that cloth you run,
Yard, I think.
it clicked over a pick, what we called a pick, and it counted the picks in an 8-hour shift, and that told you how much cloth you run on each machine. Well, after every shift, when the light goes off, first thing you do is turn your pick clocks back to 0. So you knew at the end of your shift how many yards of cloth you had run that night. So,
I grew up in Freeze, down near the ballpark, but my grandmother lived about middle of Main Street, and I remember, I was born in '61, so I can remember those bells, and I knew that the bells were ringing to give people that signal that it's just about time to be there. And then there was a whistle too. It was a high-pitched whistle, and it would blow like for the supervisors to know, like if I had 5 whistles, you know, I would know that there was a phone call or I needed to get to the office or something. But I can remember the bells.
The bell that sits up here on the road is, was on top of the mill at one time. And in the early years, they rang that bell when, like 10 or 15 minutes before shift time, so people that lived here in town would have time to get up there before their shift.
Any more questions? Well, thank you all for being here, and certainly thanks to the two of you. I do want you to know we have one, I think we got one more talk. Eddie Vaughan was supposed to be here at 12:30, but he can't be here, he's at his late aunt's funeral. But I think we've got a program for a gentleman I think is going to be coming in. I'll be going around here to let people know. So I hope you will go check in with the vendors if you haven't eaten yet. This would be a great time to do that. But thank you all for being here.